Welcome to Voice of San Diego at Home. I am Scott Lewis. I'm the CEO and editor-in-chief at Voice of San Diego. I'm a little loopy. It is 175 degrees in this garage, this garage office that I've created because of this insane world we live in. And so it's Friday. I got a lot to do. Got the politics report to get out. Got a bunch of things going on. And I'm a little loopy, but we're going to have a good conversation. We have a great guest today, Sara Jacobs. She's running for Congress, 53rd Congressional District, probably the hottest race in San Diego as far as congressional, and great discussion, I think, coming up on that. I've got a lot of questions for her, and we want to hear your questions as well. Let us know what you want to know from her, what you think about the federal government these days. All positive, I'm sure. All just relaxing time in the federal government. A lot to go over. First, though, thank you to everybody who was here on Wednesday for our discussion, our town hall about schools and the sort of new pods and micro schools and not schools that are emerging and the equity issues that those present. I thought it was one of the best panels I've ever been a part of, and I wasn't a part of it, so that might have had something to do with it. Will Huntsberry ran that discussion. I couldn't have hoped that it went better. Great discussion. All these things that are happening. A lot of people creating pods. As my family is dealing with, we're getting a lot of requests to be part of a pod, micro school, or maybe we should go to the Y. There's so many weird questions going on, so many weird opportunities. I thought Dr. Tyrone Howard from UCLA put it really well. I wanted to pull his clip. Basically, hey, everybody, it makes sense why we would want this. YMCA, for example, is planning day camps, day-long day camps. Jewish Community Center, Lawrence Family in the La Jolla area, they're putting up one for a day camp. You can see why those are coming up to allow and help guide students through the day. But here was Dr. Howard with a sort of a warning and something to keep in mind as we do that.
I think now I want to be clear about this. By no means do I begrudge those parents who have the means and have the wherewithal to provide these opportunities for their children. That's their responsibility, that's their obligation, and they have the privilege and they have the means to do so. But what I do begrudge is a system that allows this kind of inequity to happen. What I do begrudge is a system that sees the inequities, know that they exist, but yet we still don't rally around them collectively to do something different, to say we're not going to allow some students to have opportunities, but yet others will be on the outside looking in.
It kept going. We had Betsy Lynch on there. She runs the Lawrence Family Community Jewish Community Center, and she talked to us again today. After that, we called her because we wanted to talk to her about some of the legal challenges that some of these organizations might face as they get into this situation, because day camps aren't allowed to technically operate while schools are in session. So when schools start, are they in session, and can these day camps run or not? It's going to be a fascinating dilemma and effort underway. She said, look, we're not trying to open these. We have to open these. We have to provide these services and help make sure kids can get through these days. An unprecedented and historic time. We've got some updates on the virus and updates on local politics, but I wanted to bring in our guest, Sara Jacobs. Sara is running for Congress. She's running for the 53rd Congressional District. Hello, Sara. Oh, can you hear me all right? Oh, no. She froze. Let me try this again.
Here with you.
Back? Oh, there you are. Hello. You hear me all right?
Hi. Yes, great to be here with you.
Yeah, perfect. It'll catch up in a second. Thank you. It's a great opportunity to have you. Appreciate it. Again, folks out there, no holds barred. Holds barred. Let's keep it real. But send your questions in. I'll ask the best ones. We'll get it through. We've got a lot to go over. The post office. We've got healthcare. There's a virus. There's lots of stuff to talk about. Yeah, and you look like you're not stuck in your hot garage. So where are you coming at us from?
My living room here in Bankers Hill.
Oh, okay, cool. I love Bankers Hill. All right, good. Let's get into this. So let's first of all hear a little bit about who you are. Where's your background? I think there's a lot of bio points to get through, but just tell us your background. What led you to this moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a third generation San Diegan, born and raised, went to local public schools. And I worked at the State Department in the Obama administration. I worked at UNICEF and was the CEO of an international education nonprofit before coming back home. And for the last almost 2 years now, I started and serve as the chair of San Diego for Every Child, which is a countywide initiative working to address childhood poverty here in San Diego. And since March, have really been focused on emergency childcare for essential workers. And we co-chair an equitable distance learning task force countywide with the Classrooms of the Future Foundation. So Scott, I know you've got a lot of thoughts on that topic, would love to talk with you about it.
Yeah.
And I'm really running for Congress for two pretty specific reasons. So the first is that even before COVID-19 and the multiple public health, social, and economic crises that we find ourselves, I felt like our country was at a really defining moment, and our region is losing 20 years of Susan Davis's seniority. And I felt like it was really important to have someone who'd worked on federal policy and who could really hit the ground running on day one and make sure that our region got what we needed in those first months when the big package is going to get negotiated and passed. And then, we saw in 2009 that you basically get one big thing. So I really thought we needed someone who could represent us there. And the second is that I think we need a new generation of leaders. I'm 31, I'm a millennial. My generation is very underrepresented in leadership, and we look at problems with a different lens. We have different issues that we're focused on, and I felt like it was important that we started sending those new leaders.
I feel like everybody skipped over Gen X. What about Gen X? We got the.
I don't know. I don't know what to tell you.
I feel like we lost our chance. It was like, hey, wait, what about it? All right. So you said you were at the U.S. State Department. Can you talk about what you did there? What was your role?
Yeah, I was in the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. It was a new bureau that was created in 2012. I worked in the policy office. I worked mostly on U.S. policy towards conflict zones in East and West Africa. So I was working on Nigeria policy during Boko Haram and when the girls were taken, and we had the big Bring Back Our Girls campaign. And then I also worked on two presidential initiatives around countering and preventing violent extremism around the world, and changing the way we do our security sector assistance with partner governments. So we're focusing more on good governance and human rights.
And was that like an internship, fellowship kind of thing? What's the actual role though?
No, I was there in a employee position. I was technically hired by a third-party contractor. Some weird quirks of the State Department system, because it was a new bureau, they didn't have all of the specific FTE slots. So almost everyone was hired this way. But I worked at the State Department every day. I reported to an ambassador, and I was there for 2 years in an employee position.
Got it. And then you had a role at UNICEF. Tell us what UNICEF does and what you did there.
Yeah, UNICEF is an organization that's part of the UN system that really focuses on children's issues and vulnerable children around the world. It was created in the aftermath of World War II. And I was in their innovation unit, which is a unit that really looks at all of the work UNICEF does across all of its pillars: public health, sanitation and hygiene, food and nutrition, education, and tries to figure out how we can do it better and how we can work with corporations, with other non-traditional partners that UNICEF wouldn't normally work with, to better serve vulnerable children around the world. So I was their big data lead. I created the organization's first big data strategy and hired a team that is still there that does big data work. They've been really instrumental actually in the responses to Ebola, Zika, and now COVID-19, looking at mobility data and trying to figure out, some of the insights we can learn from data on how to respond better. And I set up a big data early warning system that enabled us to respond to exogenous shocks faster.
Got to drop an exogenous shot or a shock here somewhere.
I had to get my $1,000 word in there somehow.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Just a note about Sarah. She sent me a note one time when a loved one passed away. It was really nice. It moved me. And then I was having coffee a couple of days later, and I saw her across the way, and I went up and I said, it really meant a lot. That's great to see you, Sarah. It meant a lot that you sent that. Thank you so much. And she looked at me like, I don't know what you do here. Turns out it wasn't her. I was just an idiot going up to talk to somebody. I swear that was your doppelganger. It looks.
I still want you to please find her because I
know.
can really use a body double.
All right. All right. Well, we got a lot of policy stuff to get into, but I tried to do some background about about the race, and I was shocked, and I knew this was probably possible, but I was kind of shocked at how many of the stories are framed like, oh, it's this billionaire heiress versus, a progressive activist, stuff like that. Can you talk for a minute? And a lot of the questions that I got about the race, when I've solicited questions were about like your wealth and stuff like that. Can you talk for a minute about your wealth, about how you've dealt with that and the descriptions that you've heard out there? I know you're, it just seems like something that keeps coming up. Let's just talk about it for a minute.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think the national press likes to frame it that way. I think you solicited your questions from Twitter, if I had to guess, which we know Twitter is not real world, or at least I try to remind myself of that. It's definitely not how people in the district are seeing things, as evidenced, I think, by the results in the primary. But look, I'm really proud of everything that my family has accomplished and really grateful for everything that San Diego has given my family. And that's why I've dedicated my career to public service. That's why I've worked to build a fairer and more equitable world in San Diego, whether that was at UNICEF, the State Department, or now with San Diego for Every Child here at home. And to me, it's about knowing that because I was the beneficiary of great public education here in San Diego, of so much that San Diego has to offer, that I need to use that to make sure that every kid in San Diego has those same kinds of opportunities.
Yeah. One of the, as you talk about children, let's talk about that group. It is called San Diego for Every Child. You formed it, I guess, 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like basically you want to get rid of childhood poverty for children. I'm sorry, that's a little redundant, but what was interesting is you have partnered with some pretty active groups. This isn't just a feel good thing. Like there's some real active groups. You've got LISC, you've got CPI in there, and they've got some real policy ideas, particularly from the progressive side. What exactly is happening with that coalition?
It's a good question. When we originally formed, we built this coalition on...
Sorry, that was my fault.
Oh, that's okay. We built a coalition to address the experience of childhood poverty in San Diego. Even before COVID-19, we had about 40% of our kids living in families experiencing poverty, which we defined as under 200% of the federal poverty line. And I thought that in a county as wealthy as San Diego, that was simply unacceptable. And while there was a lot of really great work being done, clearly we weren't doing enough, and we needed to figure out what was working, that we could scale, what the gaps were that we needed to fill, how we could empower families themselves to be the ones deciding how this funding gets spent. And so originally this was about 4 main components: making sure that every kid had stable housing, had nutritious food, had quality early care and education, and had access to quality healthcare. And we created this set of metrics, and we're working towards that. We officially launched publicly in January, and then COVID happened in March. So we pivoted pretty quickly. And as soon as it was clear that schools were going to be closing, we convened a series of conversations with school districts, community leaders, parents, et cetera, and identified 3 key needs of children in San Diego during this time. And that was childcare. Who's going to watch the kids if they weren't in school, especially for essential workers, food and nutrition, given that so many families rely on the school system for food, and then how we make sure that as learning transitions into a distance model, that we are not exacerbating and furthering that inequitable system and that learning loss that we're seeing right now. And so the first thing we did was stand up in partnership with a number of organizations, emergency childcare group. And as part of that, we've now been able to mobilize over $50 million actually for emergency childcare here in San Diego, $16 million of that in vouchers and subsidized childcare for families. And then the county just passed $24 million for childcare providers themselves. And now we are co-chairing this equitable distance learning task force with the Classrooms of the Future Foundation.
So yeah, what would that look like? I'm really, obviously, we had that conversation. You saw that clip we pulled from the beginning.
I actually watched the whole town hall.
Oh, good. Yeah. Well, what did you take away from it?
Well, what our report is coming out soon, and I will definitely make sure you see it. But basically, in convening this conversation with district leaders, community organizations, families, we found that connectivity and devices is baseline. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient, and that we can't just think that as long as we get every family connectivity and a device, that then we'll have equitable distance learning. But there's so much more that needs to happen, and we need to make sure that teachers are getting the training that they need. We need to make sure that the parent or their caregiver is being engaged and given information in a language they understand and given the training and support that they need to really support their student. And then we know kids need a safe place to go. So that was, I think, what the gist of your town hall was about. But who's watching the kids if they're not in school, and where do they go? How are we supporting out of school time providers, other childcare providers that are now having to step up in this different role, and how are we making sure that's being done equitably?
I remember when I moderated a debate that you were doing with when you ran for Congress in 2018, and I remember there was a moment that stood out where you're like, "Look, I'm." There was just this, I can't remember exactly what the context was, but you basically pointed out to the crowd, like, I'm the only woman up here. And that gives me a perspective that you're just not going to see with that. It feels like you have really used a lot of that energy to bring to this moment, that realizing that this is going to be a problem in large part borne by women. And I think, we can all have these conversations in our families about what's going to happen individually, but it is a crisis. I mean, do you feel like we're heading towards a major crisis for women in particular?
Oh, I'm deeply concerned. Even before this moment we're in, San Diego had the second lowest labor force participation of women of any major city in the United States, which is, I can think of a lot of cities. I really don't want to know that we're so far behind them on this important indicator. And I think it really belies a larger issue that so much of this was getting papered over by families just figuring out how to make it work, often by moms taking time out of the workforce or cutting back. And now we're seeing that just laid bare. And there's so much we need to do to fix it. I think as a first start, we need to make sure that $50 billion is allocated by the federal government for childcare infrastructure, because we'll never really be able to open up our economy if we don't have a childcare infrastructure that's intact. And so many childcare providers are often low-income women of color. So making sure that they can make it through this time is really important from an equity perspective in multiple ways.
Do you think the schools should be trying to be more flexible, more creative to get open right now? Or do you agree, that this isn't the right time, that we should patch together other opportunities in the meantime?
I'm frustrated, honestly, because at this point we only have bad options. And I've talked to school administrators who are struggling because they only have bad options. Teachers who are afraid to teach. My youngest sibling is a teacher. I don't really want him in a classroom. That scares me. But also parents who have made it work till now, but really are not sure they're going to be able to keep doing that. And a lot of this, I think, comes down to our lack of a federal response. I mean, in an ideal world, I think we should be able to open schools, but that would have meant that in March, when we started shutting things down, we said our goal is to open schools in September, and every decision we make is going to be in service of that goal. Obviously, that's not what happened. And now we're asking schools who are already underfunded to try and do this Herculean task with guidance changing all the time. Right, part of what I hear from parents and from school administrators is the uncertainty is the hardest part. Our school districts here were planning for blended learning, then they couldn't do blended learning. Now maybe they can do blended learning again, so you can't even really plan. I think we need funding from the federal government to the schools to make sure that schools are able to open safely and have what they need to open safely. But without that federal investment, I think it's unfair to ask schools to take this on.
So there is some money in the HEROES Act that passed the U.S. House. It did not get, of course, through the Senate. The Senate stopped negotiations. Could that have been done better if you're part of Congress at that point? Is there anything you can do to have aided that? Or is that just not the place for a young, first timer in Congress, that kind of thing?
No, I absolutely think that it should have been done differently, and it could have been done differently. I am proud to be endorsed by Congresswoman Katie Porter, and she's exactly the kind of freshman I intend to be, one who is not just a first year who goes along to get along, but really pushes for priorities that are important for my community. I was saddened that in the original legislation that did get passed, that I didn't believe they included enough funding for childcare. In addition to many other things that it didn't include enough of, but also that they didn't put in place a kind of automatic stabilizer so that the unemployment benefits, so that the PPP, as flawed as it was in implementation, so that all these other protections that were in it would continue until our economy got better instead of some arbitrary political deadline this summer.
It's interesting you brought up endorsement of Katie Porter. She's obviously a star among the people on the left. You did get an endorsement last week or a couple weeks ago from Morgan Murtaugh, who ran for this seat against Susan Davis, who held the seat for a long time. And she pointed out that one reason to support you was that AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, had supported your opponent, Georgette Gomez. And so that in and of itself, she said, should scream, vote for Sara Jacobs. Don't be a self-identified socialist on the other side of the country. Don't let a self-identified socialist on the other side of the country influence our election. Don't let a progressive socialist get elected to Congress from our district. Do you consider yourself to the left or to the right of Georgette?
Honestly, I am very grateful for Morgan's endorsement. I think she said straight out at the top, we agree on very little. But that's not why she endorsed me. She endorsed me because she knows that I will listen and that I respect her, and that even when we disagree, we can find areas of, common respect. I think this whole who's to the left of who is a little bit of a false notion. I support Medicare for all. I support a Green New Deal. I consider myself a progressive. I also know that the only way to get anything done anywhere, and especially in Washington, is to be able to build coalitions with people you disagree with and to find common ground and to find ways to work across the aisle to actually get things done. And that's what I will be focused on, getting things done for the people of the 53rd District.
Mm-hmm. The Medicare for all, let's talk about that for a second. I think one of the big differentiators in the different plans is whether people could still have private options, private insurance options. And there's been some plans that would say, no, we need to take all the money that's sent to those. So, the premiums that I pay on behalf of that our organization pays on behalf of our employees, and then the premiums that they have to pay, that all of that money should go maybe instead to a one system single payer. So maybe nobody loses in that. But then this one centralized entity manages that care, that insurance. But then there's other options too that say, no, you could still add a Cadillac plan in a different way or what. Do you have a preference along that spectrum?
I mean, I would vote for any of the bills that are called Medicare for All in the House. I personally support Pramila Jayapal's bill. But for me, I feel like this moment has actually further clarified how important having a Medicare for all like system is, because in parts of the 53rd district, we have about 30% unemployment. And so when you have an employer-based healthcare system, in the middle of a global pandemic, you have 30% people who just lost their healthcare, let alone the people who already didn't have access to healthcare. And so in some ways, we're about to get a de facto public option as it is, because all of these people who have lost their jobs are going to be joining Medi-Cal or Medicare if they're old enough. And so rather than that, I think we should just create a strategic single payer system that covers everybody.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. One of the debates Joe Biden appeared to weigh into the other day was this question of a national mask mandate. Do you think that the president, the Congress, the federal government should be telling the country that everybody needs to be wearing a mask, at least inside?
Yes, I think we need a national mask mandate. I think we need a national testing and tracing program. I think we need a national program to make sure we have manufacturing capacity for when there is a vaccine that gets proven successful. And one of the things I'm very concerned about, having worked at UNICEF on these issues, is that it's not just vaccine development, it's not just vaccine manufacturing, it's also the distribution and how you build up that network of trusted messengers to really get that vaccine out to everyone who needs it. And we already know so many people are disconnected from our healthcare system to begin with. And I think that's a real challenge that we haven't even begun to start thinking about how to address from Congress's perspective.
On the that's an interesting question that just came up from the audience, was this question of school choice. As we talked about some of the national discussions, the Democrats have always had kind of a variety of opinions on school choice issues, on charter schools and availability of those. And now with this system that's come out, one of the ideas that came to my mind was like, if one way that people could be immediately assisted with some of these childcare issues is if the school systems actually handed out some funds that maybe they're not using to clean classrooms right now, if they're not going to be in session, that sort of thing, to actually help people with childcare in this time. Do you think there needs to be more options for parents, or do you think there needs to be fewer and more like just bolster traditional options, traditional school systems?
I think as we're seeing right now, the most equitable way of providing education is through the public school system. And I'm a proud graduate of local public schools. First of all, if you talk to the districts, they don't actually have that much extra funding because of all these other costs associated with what's happening right now. And I think it's really important that none of what we do in the short term to help people actually ends up undermining our ability and capacity to serve the community down the road, which is why we actually decided to do the child care vouchers the way we did them. A lot of cities were doing pop-up childcare. We wanted to preserve the childcare infrastructure that already existed in San Diego as much as possible, so that when we got to the other side, it would still be there instead of having to recreate it. And that's my same perspective with schools. We don't want to be using this as an opportunity to take funding away from our already underfunded private schools, public school system.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you want to, let's see, one of the things that came up with this pandemic, of course, has been this series of major relief bills. We just talked about the HEROES Act and money that might be going to schools, might be going to different places, and it's stalled. But there was a previous gigantic relief package as well. Now there's, a lot of people are wondering, like, how much more can we do of this sort? Bernie Sanders proposed a major tax on sort of wealth gains during the pandemic. There's been proposals for very large wealth taxes that were in the, not large, I guess that's a subjective point, but Elizabeth Warren had a wealth tax in her program. Is that something you think is a priority to fund sort of these ongoing things, or can we be even more liberal with debt?
Well, I support a wealth tax. I support raising the top marginal tax rate and raising the capital gains rate to match it, and closing a number of loopholes that was in the 2017 Republican tax bill that increased our debt without doing anything, in my opinion, to grow our economy. On the second part of your question, I actually think that the lesson we learned from 2009 is that the worst thing you can do in an economic crisis is be so concerned about the deficit that you don't do the stimulus thing that's needed, and then you actually have a sluggish recovery, which ends up being worse for the deficit because you don't have the tax base. And so in my mind, the most important thing that we can do right now is spend the money we need to stabilize, to get our communities and our families and our small businesses through this crisis, and then to stimulate the economy on the other side. And that will be more important to make sure that then we have a growing economy that we are able to recoup the deficit from.
Yeah. Let's talk about one thing I wanted to circle back with you about. It was a couple months ago, we watched cities across the country rally and protests happen, movement, a real unrest, and concern about just a crisis of trust in law enforcement, in institutions of law enforcement. This hit home in city halls across the country. We had more traffic on our arcane budget stories than we've ever had. People wanting to understand things. A lot of people who had trouble understanding the difference between police departments and school districts, things like that. But there was a big message. One of the message was that we need to demilitarize the police and redirect money from the police to other priorities in the community. But that was a little hard to pull off. You actually criticized Georgette Gomez. She's the city council president. She's running against you in this race for not acknowledging what people wanted in the budget, wanted to see. And then you said, I wouldn't have voted for it in its current form. Georgette Gomez and the council passed a budget that didn't increase the police department. And I think what you're implying there is that they should have perhaps cut the police department or redirected some of those funds. Is that a fair conclusion from what you said?
Yeah, I think that what we heard in all of those phone calls into City Hall were the same things that we heard in protest after protest across the country, that we need to reprioritize and we need to reassess and we need to redirect funding to focus on social services and the kinds of programs that, even the police don't want to be doing, like homeless outreach, like, mental health care, all these things that should not be the police department. We need to make sure we're investing in those social services. I talked to so many young people who had become newly energized and excited around politics and local politics in particular because of these protests and because of this issue. And the fact that their first experience engaging with politics was a bunch of city council members on a dais ignoring their phone calls is frankly heartbreaking to me.
Yeah. And I think that was the heart of what you were saying, is like they should have been literally acknowledged. Like, I heard you. I think we asked Georgette that, and she said, yeah, it was such a late night. It was so busy. We were I couldn't get the votes to make the kind of changes they want. And we had to do the best we could. But I think she acknowledged that, yeah, she should have acknowledged what those callers said. Would you think that's good enough? It's just a tough night. Oh, did I lose you? Sorry. Can you hear me, Sarah?
I hear you now.
Oh, sorry. Well, I guess, Georgette, can you?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Georgette had explained that, saying like, look, it was just a busy night. I tried to make budget adjustments. I tried to make changes, but we could not get the votes for that. And I probably should have acknowledged what the people said a little bit better. And then she made pledges to make changes. Was that not enough, do you think?
Well, I think it lends itself to a larger problem, which is right now the way the system is organized, we have a couple hours where people can make 1-minute phone calls at the end of a process where the deals have already been baked. And that's why a big part of my focus is actually how we reimagine even what governance looks like. Can we build in more points where we can have participation in the budgetary process? Can we make sure that it's not just at the very end that people can weigh in and their only options are yes or no, but actually we're having that participatory system throughout the process?
Is at the heart of that, though, was the question of police unions and their rights, their privileges to negotiate agreements, and then the city council's obligation to, uphold that agreement that is come to. Our police unions, our public sector unions, teachers unions, do we need to reevaluate our relationship with them?
I think it's a difficult question because we know for so many people, labor unions are important for the protections that they have, and frankly are the only countervailing force that we have against, a lot of these big corporations. And so I think it's important that we support labor unions in general, but I do think that there's a lot we can do at the federal level, which is what I'm running for, to make sure that we are promoting better behavior, that we are able to hold people accountable, that we are reimagining the system and reinvesting in other priorities that we know have really been underfunded over time. And that we are also recognizing that policing happens in a broader societal context of racial injustice, and we need to address all of it. I think we need a truth and reconciliation process because, in my work working on post-conflict issues, we're never really going to be able to move forward if we don't recognize and address our past. And that's something that the United States has not done yet. I think we need to look at something like HR 40, the bill to study reparations. I think we need to look at all of the ways that Black Americans have been left out of government programs, like the post-World War II GI Bill, like how redlining affected their ability to buy homes. And I think there's a lot we need to do to address racial justice. It's why I worked on a plan to prioritize racial justice at the federal level with a number of community members and community groups, which is on my website. And it's a work in progress, but I'm actually really hopeful right now because I am seeing so many young people who I can't tell you, literally, I'd never heard them talk about politics before. So many older people who never really thought about racial justice in this way, starting to see things differently. I really think we're at a turning point, and I have a lot of hope.
So you brought up redlining. That brings up a question. So the president keeps talking about how he wants to protect suburbs, keep invasions from happening. I think we all know what he's trying to say underneath that. But there is a really interesting conversation to be had, I think, about the remnants of redlining. So redlining is the concept of areas of town where people were literally not allowed to live or were not allowed to get loans to build homes, to own homes. And the remnants of that is still in existence. And I think one of your partners in the San Diego for Every Child coalitions, LISC, Ricardo Flores, he's been making a point really quite regularly that one of the remnants that exists is single family home zoning, and that it needs to be challenged, that you can still have a single family home if you'd like, but you shouldn't be allowed to prohibit other developments from occurring around you that would allow more diversity and more people to live in those areas. The president's made that a federal issue. What do you think on that, Tay?
Look, I'm Jewish, and actually, when my great-grandparents first moved to San Diego, they lived in College area because it was one of the few places that Jewish families were allowed to live. So, my family has experienced that kind of discriminatory housing policy firsthand. I think that what we don't want is the federal government coming in and making blanket policies. What we can do is create grants that encourage municipalities to reform their zoning so that it is more inclusive. We can also make sure we have federal funding to build new low-income housing through funding that housing trust and the Capital Magnet Fund, and fix the low-income housing tax credit, which was kind of gutted in the 2017 Republican tax bill. So I think there's a lot that we can do from the federal level to push in that direction. But at the end of the day, it's a local issue.
I hadn't realized how long we've gone already. Thank you so much. I got a few more, if you don't mind. You okay on time?
Yeah, no problem.
All right. Well, I wanted to talk about one. Obviously, you can't talk about housing without talking about transportation. The San Diego Association of Governments has a gigantic plan that they've just presented today for a massive investment in transit, and basically under the concept of they want you to be able to get anywhere in San Diego as conveniently by public transit as you can on a car. And that's, if you live in San Diego, you know what a stretch of imagination that is. But it's a gigantic, very expensive plan. And the guy's Hassan Akrada is the executive director. And his point is like, look, you've set these climate goals. You can't hit these climate goals because of how much the carbon emissions from cars affects them. You have to drastically reduce that, and thus you're going to have to do that. If you want what you say you want in climate, you need this. If you don't want that, that's a different discussion. But to get that, it's going to need a massive investment from the federal government. What would you be able to say about your ability and desire to fund something like that by, pulling on the federal government's purse strings?
I think we have a unique opportunity right now. The silver lining of all of the incredible suffering we're going through right now is that we do have an opportunity to make some really big decisions at the federal level with big funding going to job creation in things that we need. The decisions that were made in the 2008, 2009 stimulus discussions literally had generation changing consequences on the economy. It created new industries, it supercharged other ones. And so, one of the policies I've put out is actually how we make sure that in the next stimulus package, we are looking at climate change and infusing climate change into that stimulus package. And a big component of that is in infrastructure spending and making sure that the federal government is investing in what we know is crumbling infrastructure across this country. And we're doing it in a way that promotes getting to our carbon emission goals.
Okay, Postal Service, we wanted to talk about that. I tried to do some backgrounding and try to understand the situation financially that the post office is in. The long and short of it is people are sending less mail than they used to, and that it still is on paper, receiving more money than it spends. But one of the things that happened was a couple years ago, led largely by Republicans, they passed a bill that said that the post office has to estimate how much it's going to owe people for post-employment retirement benefits for healthcare for the next 75 years, which when you do that math and then you amortize it, the cost of that, you project a very significant deficit for the post office. So right now they can just pay every year what they need to make their healthcare and retirement obligations. But this would say now you need to project that and finance it. And that's led to a financing crisis that has given the president what he feels is a mandate to really meddle and change and reorganize the post office. That, of course, comes with it a lot of implications about the mail, about voting right now. But what's your take on the whole situation? And is that a law that you would repeal, or how would you address some of those long-term obligations?
We absolutely need to repeal that law. It makes no sense. They're the only entity that has to do something like that. My aunt and uncle are actually 30-year postal worker employees. My uncle Jerome works at the Adams Avenue Post Office, so some of you might have seen him there. And I'm proud to be endorsed by the American Postal Workers Union local here. Having an aunt and uncle who, my aunt is actually on the executive board of the union, having had conversations with her over the years, it's clear that law was intended to do exactly what it's doing right now, which is to enable a Republican administration to use the threat of a fiscal crisis to enact widespread changes that we know have very little to do with the actual fiscal crisis. So I think, first of all, we need to repeal that 2006 law. Right now, we need bipartisan support in Congress to allocate funding to support the post office. And I believe if we get Republicans to support it, that the president won't veto it. And then we really need to look longer term what kinds of investments we need to do to make sure the post office can stay solvent. I mean, it actually is not, it doesn't take any taxpayer money except when it needs it in time like this, but it has a number of these mandates from Congress that make it much harder. So I think there's a lot that we can do there to protect postal workers and to make sure that people get their mail. You know, you mentioned the election, which is incredibly important. So many small businesses rely on the Postal Service to get, especially now, to get their products out. So many elder people rely on the post office to get their medicine. You know, these are really important things. And the post office is the only entity that does that last mile delivery and that makes sure that everyone gets the mail, not just people in denser areas or people who can afford it.
Do you believe he's really doing this to hamper the election results, to skew them?
I have to tell you, as someone who has worked in electoral issues and on violence around elections, I'm deeply worried about the rhetoric coming out of the White House and what they're doing right now with the Postal Service. If we were seeing this in another country, it would have raised serious red flags, and the US government would be engaging with our partner governments to try and make sure that it didn't happen. So, you know, I do believe that what we're seeing the Postmaster General do right now is linked to this election. And, you know, we've heard from folks on the ground that it's, you know, the machines that they're decommissioning, that's not about funding. That is just about trying to hamper the post office's ability to get their job done.
One of the things you mentioned, the mandate that the post office has, one of the mandates is that it has to invest for retirement benefits into federal debt. It can only invest in bonds from the U.S. government. One of the proposals of reform would be to allow it to, like other pension funds, invest in companies. Is that something you'd consider?
I'm sorry, you broke up for a second, so I didn't catch that whole question.
It was about whether you would allow the post office to invest. So right now, it's only allowed to invest in federal bonds, U.S. Treasury bonds, and for its retirement benefits, whether it could invest in U.S. companies the way a lot of other pension plans do. Oh, shoot. Looks like we may have lost that real quick. Let's check. Sarah, can you hear me now? There you go.
I think it's something we should look into. I think the most important thing is doing it in a way that protects those workers' pensions because they paid into it, so they deserve it. But one of the things I do think we can do is create postal banking and actually use our postal infrastructure that we know is often the only infrastructure in so many of these hard to reach areas to enable lower income families to have access to checking accounts, to have access to credit that right now is really out of reach for them.
Well, you made one of our commenters happy on that one. Okay, this is just a quick shout out. If you have any other questions for Sara Jacobs, our last chance. Looks like the internet's trying to tell us something, but put in your comment. We'll try to see if we can get that question up, and I'm probably going to have to let her go soon. But Sara, is there anything else you want to leave our viewers with about your run or about your opponent in the race? Oh, no.
You know, I'm really focused on talking to folks in the district about my vision and what I plan to bring to Congress. We're finding creative ways to continue connecting with people, having a lot of virtual events. We've had a series of town halls on racial justice. We had a roundtable on small businesses. We're releasing policies about what I would be doing if I was in Congress right now and what I hope to do when I get there. And it's really about connecting with people where they are, making sure they're able to get through this difficult time, and then presenting a vision for the future that we all deserve.
Well, Sara Jacobs, thank you so much for taking the time to come on, and we will promote this in different ways, and there'll probably be some follow-up comments. I'll let you know if there's anything of interest. Thanks again for taking the time, and maybe we'll have you back soon. Okay. That was Sara Jacobs. Sorry for the little bit of a hiccup on the stream. Thank you for coming on again, Sara. And yes, we do check these comments over time. So if you have anything else you thought we needed to know or get to, let us know. We will check that out. This has been Voice of San Diego at Home. There was one bit of news I wanted to highlight today. We have gone now below the threshold to be removed from the statewide monitoring list of of our for the COVID problem, and we now have gone 3 days, and that means that soon we could actually open schools up if we can hit that for 14 days. Look at this. He says he doesn't know how to use Facebook, but there's Andrew Keats. Apparently does know how to use Facebook. Uses the Facebook Live. Hello, Andy. Did you turn in your politics report yet? Got to get to that. So yes, hospitalizations also look good. They've dipped below 300. They're actually now at like 218. I remember a couple weeks ago we were fretting because hospitalizations for COVID-19 in San Diego County had reached into the 500s. So literally hundreds of fewer people are in the hospital suffering from this disease right now, and that is good news. We should all cheer. All right, we have a lot coming up and some great stories planned. Go to voiceofsandiego.org to follow them, and thank you for joining us, and check out everything at voiceofsandiego.org, including our at-home series. Let's see if I can pull up some of those. Yes, so our at-home series and some of the town halls that are there. Go to voiceofsandiego.org/at-home, and you can check those out. All right, thanks to everybody who weighed in and questions, and thanks to Sara Jacobs again, and we will talk to you again on Wednesday. Good night.